Alright guys, welcome back to class. Sorry for the delay. I know it's been a while. You know, as you see, we get all a haircut and things. So what we're going to actually do is continue on chapter 4. Last class we spoke about the setting of Mice and Men and how that has started to progress in chapter 4. Now, as you probably will notice if you go back to all the classes, yes, the setting is technically the same, but what happens in that setting and how the setting affects the movement of the story is what I've kind of been consistently looking at. Today, now, we're going to kind of look at the characters and we're going to look at some quotes, some really important quotes, and how the characters have developed from there. All right. As usual, we start with a summary. Section 4, Chapter 4. All the men go into town on Saturday night except Lenny, Candy, and Crooks. Crooks reluctantly allows Lenny into his room where they talk, and Crooks taunts Lenny that George may not return. Leaving Lenny on his own, Lenny begins to panic at this thought, and Crooks is forced to apologize in an attempt to calm Lenny down. Candy joins them, and he and Lenny let it slip to Crooks their intention to buy a farm. They are interrupted by Curly's wife, who is looking for company. Candy and Crooks resent her presence, and when Crooks orders her out of his room, she attacks him verbally using her superior social status as a white woman. Now, what's actually happening in in America today with the Black Lives Matter movement is actually a very interesting comparison to this. Crooks, who is a black character in the novel, is seen as an outcast. In fact, this whole chapter is kind of a gathering of the outcasts. Curly's wife as a woman, Candy as an older man who can barely move, George who has a mental problem, and Crooks who is black. But if you notice that out of all of these outcasts, it's actually the black man who is at the lowest level, right? And in this chapter, we notice that becoming an issue. We're going to talk about race in the themes class, but I want us to look on how the characters relate to each other and how we kind of start to break down this characterization by even focusing on this chapter, which is the chapter of the outcasts. Now, the first quotation we're going to look at Crooks and how he is as a person. Crooks possessed several pairs of shoes, a pair of rubber boots, a big alarm clock, and a single-barrel shotgun. And he had books too, a tattered dictionary and a mauled copy of the California Civil Code for 1905. There were battered magazines and a few dirty books on a special shelf over his bunk. A pair of large gold-rimmed spectacles hung from a nail on the wall above his bed. Now, it's important to look at the fact that Crooks has a lot of possessions, and as a black man, his possessions is really all that he has for his identity. He doesn't have a lot of people to talk to. In fact, he has no other black person to talk to on this ranch. And these possessions kind of define him as a character. Now, what we're also looking on is the fact that these items kind of say something about him. So a dictionary, he's always trying to teach himself words and meanings, which is interesting because he might be defined differently as a human than the other characters. Then we look on the California Civil Code. I'm pretty sure the author wanted us to know that he has a civil code because as a black person, his civil rights are totally different than others. So he probably has a civil code as a way of even defending himself. He probably has to use this a lot to kind of defend his human rights. Then we notice few dirty books, that's porn magazines, a pair of large gold-rimmed spectacles hung from a nail on the wall above his bed. Then we went to our next quote that says, the room was swept and fairly neat, for Crooks was a proud, aloof man. He kept his distance and demanded that other people kept theirs. Right? His body was bent over to the left by his crooked spine, and he was hit by a horse, so that's why he got a crooked spine, and they defined him Crooks because of that. But it's also very interesting to see that they kind of break down the fact that Crooks himself is named based on his inefficiencies, his deficiencies, the fact that he has a crooked spine. There's a high chance that he would have been called Blackie or Blacks because he's a black person that was on the ranch. Now, it also said that he was proud. You find that as a black person in these situations, in that time, he had to be. he had to be proud, or he had to be strong, because black people were tested and broken a lot. Now, there's another quote where he even said, and we'll talk about this in themes even more, but where he talks about the fact that he's black, that he doesn't really get a chance to play cards. Anyway, next quote. Crooks leaned forward over the edge of the bunk. I ain't a southern Negro, he said. I was born right here in California. My old man had a chicken ranch, about 10 acres. The white kids come to play at our place, and sometimes I went to play with them, and some of them was pretty nice. Now, we have to also look at the fact that southern Negroes were actually treated a lot worse, because that's where a lot of the plantations were, because it was better climate in the south, it didn't get cold, and it was always known that the south was very vigilant. They tortured blacks. They lynched blacks even after slavery was abolished. So the South was known as a very dangerous and rough place for blacks to be. So he actually had a lot of pride saying that he was from California, saying that he was from the West. Now, then he goes on to say, Crooks laughed again. A guy can talk to you and be sure you won't go blabbing. Couple of weeks and then pups will be alright. They're talking about the puppies. George knows what he's about. Just talks and you don't understand nothing. He leaned forward excitedly. This is just a nigger talking. And a busted back nigger, so it don't mean nothing, see? You couldn't remember it anyways. I seen it over and over. A guy talking to another guy, and it don't make no difference if he don't hear or understand. The thing is, they're talking, or they sitting still, not talking. It don't make no difference. No difference. His excitement had increased until he pounded his knee with his hand. George can tell you screwy things and it don't matter. That's just the talking. It's just being with another guy, that's all. He paused. Now, remember, Crooks is talking to George, and George isn't so right in the head. But what he's doing, he's defining himself as a type of Negro, and saying that because he's just a nigger, as you notice, the term nigger is used rather than Negro, right? Because he's just a nigger, which is a derogatory term, that what he says doesn't mean anything. So he's letting us know, or you can even say the author is letting the reader know that on this ranch, despite how good his job is, despite the fact that he keeps to himself, despite that he's a proud man, the simple fact that he's black, and not just black, but a busted back black person, means that what he's saying doesn't matter to them. They don't care what he has to say. Alright? Another thing that we learn about characters, when Crooks then says, well, just suppose he don't come back, what will you do then? That's a very important line, and we're going to touch on it a little more in themes, but I wanted us to know that in that section we really understand just how much Lenny loves George and wants to defend George, but also just how much there's a little bit of foreshadowing, and that there's some sort of threat that George could go away and leave Lenny, and that Lenny is worried about that. And we know that there's a threat because it's something that Lenny kind of comments on, well, that George comments on by telling Lenny, you know, he'd be better off if he wasn't around, if they weren't together. So there's a little foreshadowing, a little bit of worry, and a little bit of nervousness on George's side. The last quotation that I wanted to go to, well, rather than the quotation, I wanted to kind of just close off speaking about Curly's wife, and we're speaking about characters. And what we're looking at here is that there are levels to this social status and this social class. Here we have a group of outcasts, right? Black person, someone who has a mental issue, someone who is really old and seen as useless. They don't even take him into town. And then we just have a woman. And for some, a woman lacks attention, but may not be really in a lower status. But then, because of how she acts due to the amount of attention that she lacks, she is then looked down upon. And that is where Curly's wife becomes a very important character that moves the plot of the script, because as a woman, that attention that she lacks she tries to make up for it and she tries to seek this attention, and then she finally finds it somewhere, and that affects the plot of the story. How she as a woman and the attention she lacks, and where it puts her in this social setting, right? So it's the setting comes back, and where it puts her in this social setting then affects the themes and the plot itself. Next class we're going to dive into themes a little bit more, because a lot of themes to work with these group of outcasts, and we're going to talk about it there. All right, pick up yourself.